So you're very welcome. This is a conversation with Siobhan Davies, and we're going to talk today about about dancer knowledges and archiving and legacy and transmission of ideas. So it's a real treat. I'm just really quickly going to read out, because we haven't had much time in the Q&As. So we haven't had much time to just read out a quick little biog. So because we have a minute here, I'm going to do that. So just to say to everybody, Siobhan Davies is Artistic Director of Siobhan Davies Dance and a renowned British choreographer who rose to prominence in the 1970s. Davies was a founding member of London Contemporary Dance Theatre, and in 1982 joined forces with Richard Alston and Ian Spink to create independent dance company Second Stride. Establishing Siobhan Davies Dance in 1988, she consistently works closely with collaborating dance artists to ensure that their own artistic inquiry is part of the creative process. By 2002, Davies moved away from the traditional theatre circuit and started making work for gallery spaces and other sites. Her artistic practice involves bringing together a collective of artists and choreographers to create within an environment that supports them to share common investigative concerns alongside their own work. So just to have
Thanks, Liz. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, not at all. It's just brilliant to have you here. And we're going to talk a little bit for about 15, 20 minutes. And at any point, if people want to ask a question, you can put it into the Q&A, or you can raise a hand and we can bring you up to talk about it. This is very exciting because a lot of the processes that we've been talking about over the last 2 days about what now, what do we invest in the future, how do we change a practice which is not becoming obsolete, but there is a threat there, what do we do? And what's really interesting is that this is something that you've been branching out into for many years, and you've been creating networks and tapestries of support for work like this to happen. And I'd love you to just talk about maybe the work over the last 2 to 3 years specifically, and the direction that you've been taking.
Well, there's an overarching activity, which is that I am stepping down as artistic director of, as everything from the studios and from the organisation. And in order not to make that, in order to make that a more lively, deeply known transition, rather than just a kind of snap election, we did something called organizational choreography, which is meant that we approached lots of dancers, choreographers. We tried to get our full team involved in the quest of what is the company of the future, what is the organization of the future. And although, of course, I would love them to use our fund, not intellectual fund, fund of adventure, curiosity, investigation, I also have the expectation that the new people will take it on in quite different directions, particularly after what we've gone through this year. And I'm very excited by that. But that was called organizational choreography because in some ways I wanted to use choreographic principles, how to pull people together, how to ask them to ask the questions that are needed, how to find ways of working together, and use that all the way across from the Arts Council, our board, our team, and as many artists as we could involve in dinners, conversations, emails, whatever else it was. So the table was large and long for 3 years in order that at a certain point, in fact, it's been shortlisted to 7 artists, some of them are duos, to make a bid for to lead the company on. So that's in a way been the huge thing, but to actually use the word choreography in that rather than as the abiding principle. Materials Rearranged to Be was the last work that I was the overall responsible person for, but even in that, it led on from Table of Contents, a previous work where Table of Contents although I involved each of the 6 or 7 artists now to be responsible for the strands of work that they put in, it was still a Siobhan Davis dance piece. By Materials Rearranged to Be, I commissioned both visual artists and choreographers to make work in which we all chose the principal theme, which was the Warburg collection, and very particularly the Nemesis Atlas, as our common ground. And then each person would make work in relationship to that common ground, but they would own the work. So their work was their responsibility, and that at the end of the project, in which all of the works were performed together in gallery spaces, they could take that work away and do with it what they wanted. And then the final thing is making a film with David Hinton, whom I've made 2 films with previously. And in a way, I'm not so keen on legacy as an idea, but in a way, it will, I think, hold many of the effervescent bubbles of curiosity that I have had from visual art, from botany, from science, from studying animal movement, from whatever. All of those strands that have that emerge on occasion brightly in my making processes, and then fade, and then emerge brightly again, and then fade. Is there a way of making a film of tapestry, in a way? Is there of the meshwork in which I feel I have been involved with as a choreographer? And the meshwork, of course, includes loads of other artists and loads of other collaborators. That's roughly it.
Fantastic. It's very interesting because yesterday responses from people a lot, I suppose, to what's going on at the moment. People were talking about, I suppose, in a sense, this split they feel between the struggle to make work and then the artist. And what I always find so amazing about you is that you seem to just exist in that place where that everything is about the artistic journey, and even if it's not, you make it about that. Yeah, and I think that's really inspiring.
Well, I think it's there is a genuine and I think perfectly correct resistance against organizational structures which by their very definition live 12 months of the year, in relationship to artistic structures which may only exist an artist when they are at work, and otherwise, and then they have to wait until the next piece of work, whereas the organization carries on. And I can feel, I have an organization, but I can feel that pain in a way. And I think to some extent it is up to us that have organizations to find out how you can dismantle the inefficiency of them and find methodologies in which they directly work with and for the questions that artists are asking right now. Because as you quite rightly said earlier, we are in a mode of change. We've been in a mode of change for quite some time, but right now that mode of change is really exaggerated. How are both artists and those who are trying to support them, and there are people trying to support them, but how are we able to remmantle pretty well everything in order that those people who are, I just was speaking to somebody involved in the environmental movement who's turning around and saying artists are the canaries. They're the ones that sing about the problems, and how are we to make quite sure that we are able to hear that very clearly and not have it smothered by other protections or other structures or other habits.
Yes, and you were also talking about, when we were talking last week, over the last number of weeks about this, that you've also done a body of work in preparing spaces, like gallery spaces, to build networks. So I suppose these, like in dance, our thing is to communicate, it's to connect, and yet we're quite restricted in how we can do that. So in that sense, it would be interesting to know about this branching out into gallery spaces and other spaces, almost making them ready for dance. And what did that entail?
Well, we were performing in galleries for quite a while. And then recently, well, actually over a year ago, we started something called Continuous, in which a gallery, and in this case it was the Baltic, and us, commissioned 2 artists, and both the gallery and us were involved right at the beginning. So they helped choose the artist, and the idea was that side by side, we would understand the problems of each methodology. You know, a gallery has certain methodologies about why they choose art, how they treat artists. A dance practice has another one. And although we might have the expectation that they would be very similar, in fact, the contexts are very different. And we take for granted and have a habitual behavior within the context of our making or our commissioning or our curating. And so the best way of learning was that you should come across each other's limitations or excitements as early as possible so that you could solve them. Mm-hmm. And in many ways we have done that, but we've also come across things that have been slower to open up and slower to go through processes of change than I think we had imagined. Now there are many other galleries involved, and you're quite right, there's a curiosity about what dance does, what live performance does, what choreography is, from gallerists and from curators, and from us. We are now performing in a different context, and the different context is also what the public bring to that place. So the public brings a very different set of curiosities and questions to a visual art gallery than they do to a theatre. Now, we could do a whole study about why they do that, but they do. And I think that's enhanced our ability to develop better discourse about what we're doing. The visual art has a huge discourse, centuries of discourse, literature, books, an enormous amount of archive, in the way that dance has archive, but normally held within a body, passed on from body to body, which I find incredibly dynamic and moving. But it's a very different sense of handing on information, and a very different sense of handing on information than gallerists have. Mm-hmm. Gallery.
Yeah.
Curator.
No, absolutely. And would you, I'm just interested, when you made, like with this process of transparencies and also materials arranged, oh my God, I can't speak.
Rearranged to be.
Rearranged to be. In a sense, that was the time that I first really became, I know, and, you know, don't mind me, I'm slow to everything, and, you know, I have no time. But that was the first time that I really, and table of contents, that I became really aware of this kind of shift in what you were making, and this idea of agency amongst, you know, the co-creators within the work. I love the way that they own the work, even though they've made it for you and with you. And also it would be interesting to know, like, what was that transition like, you know, the way that you had to restructure these choreographies to make sense within gallery spaces, and what did that entail?
It's this kind of double question there. I can answer one first, is that I think I have always, because I started dancing late and choreography reasonably late, I have always understood that making a work was made by everybody that was involved in the studio. So habit and structure and context allowed me to say I was the choreographer and the others were the performers. But over a period of time, I realized that that sort of naming was not really truthful. And I think that naming is not necessarily truthful, you know, for a very, very long time, you know, for centuries. I feel that anybody dancing the work has an ownership of it, that and brings an evolution to the work, which has been less recognized than it should be. When going into the gallery space, one of a piece that we learned a great deal with was called Minutes, which was within a work that we made. I can't remember the name of my own work. Anyhow, it was made for the Victoria Mirror Art Gallery. And Victoria Miro and I had commissioned and chosen a lot of visual artwork to appear in her space. And I made a work for a space that was right next door to where the visual art was. And the first thing we thought was, well, okay, we need to unpick this idea that we start at 7:30 and finish at 9 and the audience comes and goes. We will stick to gallery hours, which were in this instance 11 till 6. So we had to make something that lasted that long period of time. And at the same time, anybody that came into the space, they would feel as if whatever was there for them, not that they had arrived late. So we started to make things in minute structures. And it sounds quite simple, but how to make something that is within a minute structure, which allows anybody to come in to feel as if this is their minute, and then the next minute is their minute. But when they decide to go, they know these minutes are simply going to carry on throughout the day. And at the same time, be satisfying to us that we were able to develop a strand of thinking, a state of being, a coherence over a 7-hour period. You know, they were long days. And that again gave us a sense of, well, in fact, some of the visitors that came said one of the things that moved them was that they quite often stayed for a very long time, but when they left, they knew that we were continuing. And in a way, there's a moment of when you leave a gallery space and the images are still on the wall, there's that idea of there is still life in that still image. It has remained there, possibly if it was in the British Museum, it would have been there. It's been in existence for centuries. And yet when I watched it, there was a different kind of liveness. So it began to inspire in me this idea that stillness isn't only stillness, that a still image isn't still. Its history and its potential future is as much part of its being as just being on a wall and you know, perceived as still. Which meant that by the time we got to materials rearranged to be, and we studied the Warburg collection, and then certainly the Warburg collection is this huge a mass of material, still images. And one of the first things that we could alight on at that moment is don't think of them as still. Think of them as part of a constant renegotiation of relationships between different images, which happens, sorry, I'm going to talk about something that people might not understand, but do look it up, the Mnemosyne Atlas. So if you look at the Mnemosyne Atlas,
yeah.
It's Abbie Warburg's collection of images, printed images that he's taken that could be anything from Greek sculpture to a contemporary fashion photograph. He died in the early 1900s. So there was this sort of, oops, I just have to close the door.
Sure. Just to say, I've put a link up there for anybody who wants to look up about the Warburg collection.
There's a baby next door and I mustn't wake her up. So, sorry, I know I'm being rather speedy at the moment because I sort of, that's the dilemma. In a way, as a maker, I feel, and I'm sure there's everybody out there feels the same, we are layers and meshworks of, we have accrued so much information because our body has given us an additionality, our body and obviously mind. So, but because to some extent, I feel in the public eye, the articulacy, intelligence of the body has been forgotten. And because we cannot forget it, because we are bringing it to the surface, to the present, to the now, all the time, then these layers and meshworks of experience and God, you know, where the words when you need them is sometimes overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And yet that's the world we live in. We live within this world of extreme noticing. Mm-hmm. And then you have to refine a subject. And so, for instance, the first working in a gallery was, I will refine my subject about how I can make dance available to people who commonly go to an art gallery, bring with them art gallery thinking, and yet they're going to come across us. How are we going to make ourselves truly available and interesting to them? To materials rearranged to be is by then we'd had experience of working in the gallery. And now we were trying to use something that the art world has considered an important influence, Aby Warburg and all his collection, but including his methodology of putting it up on large black Hessian backgrounds, multiplicity of images, multiplicity of materials, multiplicity of contexts. And yet when you look at each and any of the atlases, it makes sense, which is what I wanted the work and materials rearranged to be. Very different works. When you walked through them and you took however many hours you wanted to walk through them, eventually a coherence of their relation made sense.
I know. We have a question coming up, but I have one more thing I just wanted to ask you before we go into that, and then we can fire away. I suppose what always strikes me is that at a time in dance where people were under huge pressure and have been under huge pressure to move out from their base and to travel, you know, and to be these dancers or choreographers that are on planes and they've got a computer and a bag and that's their life. You know, this sense of without having a base. Now, of course, we're moving into a time where people are having to look at what's immediately around them because we
local
travel. Yeah, we have to have this idea of local, and distance means something very different. And I feel that I don't want to get into trouble saying this, but I feel that sometimes it's a decision that women have to make. They have to say, because if you have a family, you often have to just say, you have to make a choice, and you have to say, I can't live that life. I have to find a balance. But now, and I know that's a generalization, I don't mean it in that way. But now actually it's everybody's life for a time. And I also wonder about, because I've felt about with you for a long time that you consolidated your base early and you located it, you located yourself in London. And I just wonder about what was that feeling, what was that decision? Maybe it's the same as all of us, but maybe, yeah.
Well, I was born in London and I went to art school, and then before London Contemporary Dance Theatre started, I started to do lessons. I was about 17. I was performing when I was 17 because there was dance in this country beforehand, but it hadn't ever collected together in a particular way. So I was at the beginning of something. And of course there was a freshness, total freshness about being gathering like the undertow of water as it turns and becomes the wave and hits the ground. We could feel the undertow that we were sort of creating, and then it tipped up and then it hit the ground, and then an enormous wave of other dance started to come into place. But there was a wonderful sense of beginnings. So then that beginning happened in my town, London. What I'm hoping is that there are other beginnings in other localities other than London, much as I love my hometown and my home city, and I feel it's done a huge amount. But there are so many other dance artists in different places now, and with real knowledge, with real excitement, I find I am very moved by the work being thought about and made in a generation of artists right now who are emerging, and they don't have a complete affiliation to a European movement or an American movement. They have arrived out of being honed by the problems and the dilemmas and the possibilities of being a British artist. So they have come into being with, I think, a very different set of molecular work within them. And I think what they are asking and what they are producing and what they're thinking about is very exciting. And this is happening all over. So, if I was at a certain beginning and there were very few of us and we crashed, now I think there are an awful lot of other people who are building up undertow, and they just need the potential and the possibility and the partnerships in order to try and make something more happen. And I think this word partnership is important, because I think we can't only relate to the list of partners that has traditionally been in our place. So that there are, I notice with certain PhDs happening that there are relationships with neuroscience, there are relationships with zoology, there are relationships with the digital world. And again, I feel our skills are a mix of massively human and true sharp curiosity. And so we need to find partnerships that are, and political curiosity as well. We need to find partnerships that help us develop that, and I think give us a broader platform, beyond galleries. Although I think it's been a massive learning curve for me, and I think for others, to try and find relationships and make them work on our terms and make them work on the other partners' terms. And that's not always easy.
No.
We have to rethink all the time. But I think dancers and choreographers do that. We are in a mode of change the whole time. We are in a mode, because we're getting older, we're in a mode of change all the time. Daily we get older. And we notice that. Daily we are in different combinations of knowledge. Daily we are in some different context, even though, as you say, we might have to remain local. I think that sense of being alert to change is one of our great skills.
Excellent.
But it's not going to make our life easy.
No, never.
No.
We have a question from Susan Sentler. It's in the Q&A, so I'm just going to read it out to you. She's just saying, thoughts on how we can extend this sense of combined shared ownership in collaboration with visual arts. For an example, when a work of a visual artist is necessitated by performance to exist as a whole, the agency and knowledge of the choreographic and the performers become shadowed or moreover invisible in relationship to the ownership of the visual artist.
I wish I understood that better. It feels like a really good question.
Susan, do you want to come up?
Sorry, Susan. Am I just not?
Is she still there? No, maybe see.
Is it if you are performing in a gallery with an artwork that she feels?
I think she's in Singapore, so she might have gone to bed. But thoughts of how to extend this sense of combined shared ownership. Oh, I think maybe relating to this idea of in collaboration between dance and visual arts. Eventually, the choreographer or the performers become invisible in this. Like, how can we have? Oh, here's Susan.
Sorry, Susan. I'm sorry. I just don't.
No. It's interesting because I kind of want to shift it now after hearing you just how you spoke. But in particular, I find, because I've done a lot of collaborations with visual artists where it's imperative that their works be performed. I mean, they can exist as object, but in reality, it needs the necessitation of the performance. But I find that we become incredibly overshadowed, or our knowledge and our abilities get overlooked. They need it desperately. It's part of the work. It's a necessity to the work, and yet it's almost like anyone can do it, or that it's not really looked upon as this kind of body of knowledge. And even the same when we start working with neuroscientists, or we start working with zoologists, or we start working with other. I always feel that there's a gap, that they're taking the lead and we're coming in some kind of fashion, but it's like our knowledge and our abilities are of a lesser, and yet they are not. And I have a problem with it.
No, I Absolutely, I agree. I think it's those early discussions. The words I use is, when you first enter into any discussion, whether it's with a scientist or a visual artist, you both have to peel right back and find out what are the essentials about each of your practice, and what you turn around and go. It's not that you won't let go of, it's just, particularly as a dance artist, you say, this is a deep and long practice. This is what I know. I'm going to know more later on, but this is what I know, and I am equal to you in this, and I'm not going to suddenly fade. So I think it's context and language, and the language within which the final work or the work process itself is given equality. I think I've been lucky. One of the areas that was the hardest, oddly, was when Victoria Miro commissioned certain works in which both the dance artists and the visual artists were working distinctly side by side to make an object. At some point, the visual art said, I make my money by selling my object. That object is mine. It's not yours and mine. And of course, in some ways, I kind of understood it, because we were being paid to make the work, and in fact, they had been commissioned. But there was this very different sense of ownership. And of course, I think we want any partnership we work with to understand that ownership is multiple, not singular. Because, and I think that's one of the things that choreography and dance has addressed, is the idea of the multiplicity of responsibility.
I think we do it inherently. It's part of just the way we work, and we have this respect and responsibility from the get-go. Whereas when you collapse into other things that perhaps don't work in that way, or work in isolation, as unfortunately loads of the modernist artist author, it can become tricky. But I do agree with you. It's those initial conversations that have to be clear as can be.
It's and I think it's when it's different. But even when we went to the Baltic, all sides have a sort of pot within us where we go, oh, they'll understand that. But actually they don't. There's a pot of knowledge that we all have, and we go, oh no, of course they'll understand it, but they don't. So it's about how to open up that pot and go, you have to look at this pot of knowledge, pot of context, or pot of experience. But it's us that has to look at it. We have to look at our own and go, other people don't know about this. How are we going to, how are we going to
open it up to discussion, revealing, etc. What goes behind to do that? Very good, very good. No, thank you.
No, pleasure.
That's great. Thank you. We're just going to bring in Erica now, who has another question. Jenny's just going to bring her up there.
You try and come in here.
Hi, Erica. How are you?
Hello there. Hi.
Hi, Erica.
Hello. Yeah, this is lovely. These days have been very exciting, these modes of capture. I'll jump straight to my question. Right, my question has to do with all this knowledge, this moving content that we collect along the way from the people that we learn and work with and collaborate with, the body as archive. And I also believe the archive is a body itself, with moving content interacting with our body as archive. How in this new ecology, or this new dance ecology that was sort of drifting into because of the circumstantial situations of this pandemic, let's say, what it's brought us to confront, how can we draw on our dance as a doing, this embodied approach to everything? How can we draw on it for future interdisciplinary collaborations? How can this sort of don't know if it's a language, if it's something, it's a question I'm constantly busy with, also through my research, and now even more so.
I think you've mentioned the word language, and I have a feeling it's languaging as well as doing. And I think we're becoming much better at languaging. but I think it's an attention to that. I'm not quite sure if I'm completely answering your question, because I've suddenly found myself going down a line and you can pull me back. But I know, for instance, that within a study of when dance goes into academia, academia's language does not necessarily support the tacit understanding that we are in the process of immersing ourselves in and emerging out of. So that we, I think, are trying to find other languages, maybe other materials, which support the experience of our doing. I'm going to mention something that I'm doing. That's not to blow my trumpet. It's just to try and say, as an experiment, I'm making this new film in which all of the imagery is still at the moment, and all of the imagery comes from very, very different disciplines and use of materials and times. And the initial performance of it, before it was a film, was all of the materials were on transparent bits of paper, so you could overlay them, and I could play them like kind of poker. But I could put them out and pull them back and put them out again. And it gave me a sort of flexibility of feeling, so that the feeling of trying to think something through didn't stay within a track. So I'm wondering whether we can also not only use language, but if we can use imagery or other materials or other connections, which is why I think we're trying to sometimes work with, let's say, a neuroscientist or a zoologist or an architect, is we're not trying to learn from them, although of course it's very lovely to do that. We're also getting them to learn from us, and then different languages start to kick up, different words start to kick up, different questions start to kick up, and then I think that expands our capacity as well as their capacities. Not really answering your question, but I just think our doing can land in all sorts of different places. Now, I think what you're saying is that maybe your doing is still in your room. Is that, and what are we worried that we're just going to be constantly on Zoom and in our room?
Yeah. Well, no, I think we can go. I believe that, dance as a methodology, and as you said, drawing on choreographic plans, we do have the ability to go beyond these rooms. These are virtual rooms as well. I do believe that strongly. It's still sort of like at a very, very early phase of happening. Yes. And I do see in transparencies how this invites a room and another space of walking into this content and being in this other environment. I'm saying it creates about creating environments. I don't know either.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's. I use the word meshwork because I try to imagine myself or others within this plethora of connections, and there's things ahead of me and there's things behind me and there's things to the side, and it's not linear, but there's a web of things that I am amongst, and that at some point I can be chosen to work with, or I can choose to work with people. There's some sort of play going on, like a physical mental play between things. That helps me because I don't want to get stuck too soon, but I also understand that at a certain point I have the responsibility to do and to make something of the moment, and then I have to clarify, and I go, this is what I'm going to do right now. But I know in a while it will be different because I will be in another state of play. I will be in another state. Not the idea of what kind of states are we in and what kind of relationships we have in order to be in a particular state of making or doing or thinking or receiving or conversation. I'm sorry, I'm just full of blah today, so I'm going to...
No, thank you.
Brilliant. So listen, we just have a few more minutes, so we might just... I have one last little question, and then we'll be there. I suppose we've been talking a lot about, over the 2 days, about dancer knowledge. And in one of our previous conversations, you were talking about this moment in your life in the 70s when you felt yourself not in yourself. slightly outside of yourself, and then you began this process. You kind of went down this journey in the making of Sphinx, this piece from 1973, and you sort of allowed your body to express itself in a particular way, and you allowed the movement to come as opposed to the thought instigating it. And you talked about the practicing of this in the making of the piece. You said, after a while I felt my body could come home. And I suppose it's just because you articulate everything so well. It would be lovely to hear you talk about that, because I think as dancers, and also what Susan is saying about getting, we're made invisible, or our knowledges are made invisible. So maybe just to talk about articulating that knowledge, and what could we do, what could we do all as dancers and choreographers to articulate that? Or how is it for you?
That's a huge question. I don't have a really brilliant answer. If I'll go back to Sphinx for a moment. I was late to dance, and therefore to some extent saw other people's bodies teaching me, and in a way I wanted to be like them, and I was trying to organize my body in a way that was useful to them and coherent to them, and on the way I was learning something. I was definitely learning something, but there was a moment in which I felt as if I was many parts. This part was attached to this part, which was attached to this part, and I was somehow trying to make sense of it. I felt like a puppet. I started to make this work, which wasn't called Sphinx at that time, in which, and I'm not quite sure how or why, I felt if I could link to the animal in me, if I could link to the past, if I could link myself to the cave art work, which I loved at the time and still do, if I could not be this 20th century young woman, but bring up, allow to well up a phrase from Guy Claxton, to allow the other in me to well up. Could I open the deep trap door? And I attempted to do that, and something arrived. Now that's, okay, I'm just going to put that to one side. I then continued to be a performative dancer in the theatre, and I think I put that piece of knowledge to one side, and I kept going with the history and the structure of theatre dancing. And then there was a certain moment in which I realized that what I was seeing in the theatre and what I was experiencing in the studio were totally different. The theatre felt cinematic, and the studio felt as if there was physical knowledge constantly being made present for anybody who watched it. It just happened to be me watching it. And how could I make that more available to everybody, rather than the sort of transfer, the transformation that seemed to happen the moment something went into the theatre? I wanted to disband that. I wanted to come home into our bodies, so that everything that we worked on in the long experience of rehearsals, not just for one work, but for the many works that maybe people were involved in, not only rehearsals in my work, but rehearsals in other people's work, how could we bring that into the studio, how we could make that true accumulated physical and mental understanding, and how could we make that available? And we had to come home in order to be able to do that. We had to come home and be local to ourselves in order to genuinely be able to reach a more diverse audience, a more oh God, I can see all sorts of things I've missed out. That's my problem with speaking with this. But I can also understand that there are certain other cultures or certain other people in our dance world for whom this may not be the way forward. And I can only say that this idea of somehow coming home to the person I am and then being able to extend from that felt the best filter that I have gone through. I did it very early on in my career and then forgot about it. And that's my sadness. And I've now, in the last 10 years, remembered it. And that's good.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to end there. I'd like to go on forever.
Thank you.
To talk to you, and it's so lovely to see you. And I just, yeah, amazing. And just to say that we've recorded this conversation.
Oh, God.
So, no, it's important. No, because it's amazing what you say. And thank you so much. And
thank you, Liz.
And
thank you, everybody. And I'll try and step back into the process a bit later in the day.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks so much. I'll be in touch soon. Take care.
Okay, good luck.
Thank you.
Bye.